What would you do if a battered dog limped into a snowstorm, locked eyes with you, and led you to a woman the world had already buried? It was supposed to be just another patrol. Jack Callahan kept his eyes on the winding road as sleet lashed against the windshield of his SUV. Pine Bridge, Montana, was a quiet town nestled in the mountains, but tonight it felt like something out of a war zone. The first snowstorm of the season had swept in hard and fast, smothering the hills in white and drowning the airwaves in static. The radio on his dash crackled now and then, but no voices came through, only silence. Thick, pressing silence that Jack had grown too familiar with. He eased off the accelerator, letting the vehicle crawl along the narrow pass. His hands were steady on the wheel, his mind replaying old memories like ghost recordings. He had been in Pine Bridge for only 3 weeks, reassigned from the bureau after an operation went south. The official report called it a tactical failure. Jack called it a personal one. The name haunted him still. Ava Carter. She had been more than just his partner in the narcotics unit. Ava was the voice that steadied him in the field, the one who saw what others missed. And she was the one who had gone missing that night at Pier 17. Her GPS had gone dark, her comms had flatlined, and Jack, pinned down under heavy fire, had to choose between chasing her or saving the wounded men beside him. The bureau labeled her MIA, presumed dead. Jack never forgave them, and he never forgave himself. The wipers squeaked across the windshield again. Snow piled at the edges of the narrow mountain road. Then, just as he rounded a sharp bend near Timberline Pass, he saw it. A shape. Motionless, dead center of the road. He tapped the brakes gently. The SUV skidded slightly before coming to a stop. At first he thought it might be a fallen branch or a bundle of discarded clothes, but as he leaned forward, squinting through the storm, he realized it was a dog. A German shepherd, large, soaked, injured. Its coat was soaked through, dark fur matted with what looked like blood along one side. One hind leg trembled, lifted slightly off the ground. But the dog didn't flinch, didn't bark, didn't cower. It just stood there, still as stone, eyes fixed on Jack's. And Jack, he couldn't look away. There was something ancient in the animal's gaze, something tired and knowing, like it had seen more than it should have. Jack felt it in his chest, that silent exchange between broken things. Most people would have honked, most would have swerved, most wouldn't have stopped. But Jack Callahan wasn't most people. He opened the driver's door. The wind hit him like a wall. Snow stung his face as he stepped out into the night, boots crunching into slush. He pulled his coat tighter around him and took a slow step forward. "Hey there, bud," he called gently. "You okay?" The dog didn't move, didn't even blink. Jack crouched, palms out, like approaching something sacred. "You're hurt," he said softly. "Let me help." And that's when it happened. Without a sound, the shepherd turned. It limped 2 paces, paused, then looked back at Jack, as if to say, "Follow me." Then it kept moving off the road, into the woods. Jack stood frozen. This wasn't random. This wasn't some stray wandering in the storm. This dog had waited for him. His hand instinctively hovered near the holster at his hip, but he didn't draw. Instead, he took one slow breath and stepped into the trees. The storm swallowed the road behind him, and the journey began. The snow grew deeper as Jack followed the dog's unsteady trail through the forest. The German shepherd moved with quiet determination, its limp pronounced but steady, as if each step were guided not by instinct but by purpose. Jack had served 4 years in the Marines, 2 in undercover narcotics. He'd been through ambushes, raids, and sting-ops that made most men break. But something about this dog unnerved him more than all of it. It moved like a soldier, watched like a partner, carried pain the way humans carried grief. Trees leaned in around them, weighed down by snow. A frozen stream cracked under Jack's boots as they crossed. The forest grew darker, the quiet more absolute, and still the dog pressed on. After 20 minutes, Jack called out again. "Where are you taking me, boy?" The dog didn't look back this time. It just kept limping forward. Jack didn't know then what he was about to find. He didn't know that buried beneath the snow was a secret someone tried to erase. He didn't know that this dog wasn't just looking for help. It was leading him back to the one person he thought he had lost forever. Ava Carter. And Shadow, though he didn't yet know the dog's name, wasn't just a stray. He was a guardian, a soldier. A memory that refused to die, and what he would reveal would change everything. The dog led Jack deeper into the woods, one slow, limping step at a time. Snow clung to every branch. The storm howled through the pines like a warning. And yet Jack followed, no questions, no hesitation. There was something unspoken between them, something ancient, a soldier who had lost, a dog who refused to give up. The further they went, the stranger it felt. Jack's instincts, sharpened by years in the field, whispered that this was not random. This dog hadn't just wandered out of the storm, it had come for him. The trail wound through a narrow ridge, then dipped into a shallow ravine lined with frozen leaves and pine needles. The dog stopped near the base of a twisted cedar tree, sniffed once, then began pawing at something beneath the snow. Jack quickened his steps and dropped to his knees beside it. The ground was hard, crusted with ice. But soon, something dark and solid emerged from the frost. Plastic, military grade. Black casing, straps torn, the kind used in covert operations. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He brushed off the ice and turned it over. On the inside of the casing, scratched by time and friction, were faint letters. A. Carter. He froze. The name burned in his mind like an old scar ripped open. Ava Carter. He hadn't said her name out loud in 6 months. Not since the operation went south, not since they filed her as presumed KIA and sealed the case with 2 dry sentences and a shrug. But now, here it was. Her locator beacon, out here, in the middle of nowhere. And this dog, this broken, bleeding animal had led him right to it. Jack stared down at the casing, his hands trembling slightly beneath his gloves. This wasn't some fluke. This wasn't chance. The beacon had been recently disturbed. It wasn't buried deep, not yet covered in full frost. Someone had been here. He looked up. The trees stood silent, blanketed in snow. No footprints, no drag marks. But something told him. Ava had been nearby. He reached out and gently touched the dog's side. "You brought me here, didn't you?" he whispered. The shepherd didn't move. Didn't blink. Just sat beside him, steady and solemn, like it had known him forever. Jack had worked with dogs like this before. Real canines, not pets. They weren't trained to sit or fetch. They were trained to survive, to sense threat, to protect, to stay when others ran. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't just a smart stray. This dog had belonged to someone. And that someone was likely Ava. Jack tucked the locator into his coat and stood slowly. He reached for his radio static. No signal, not this deep in the woods, no backup. No witnesses. It was just him and the dog. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you some help." The dog didn't budge, just looked up at him, eyes glowing faintly in the dim white light. There was sorrow there, but also something deeper. Faith. Back at his small rental cabin near the edge of town, Jack laid the dog down on an old blanket near the heater. He cleaned the wound on its shoulder as best he could, using a first aid kit from his patrol truck. The dog didn't resist, just watched him with those amber eyes. He wrapped the injured leg with gauze and an old flannel shirt. "You've been through hell," Jack muttered. The dog gave a faint grunt, then rested its head on its paw. It wasn't until later, near midnight, when Jack found the photograph. He had been digging through his unpacked files from his narcotics unit, trying to make sense of what he'd found. Trying to breathe through the rising questions. Why had Ava's gear been out there? Who brought it there? And why lead him to it now? The photo was tucked between field notes and an old case file. It was from 2021. Ava stood tall in her tactical gear, squinting uncomfortably at the camera during an awards ceremony. And beside her, sitting perfectly still, was a younger version of the same German shepherd now sleeping at Jack's feet. Jack's throat tightened. He flipped the photo over. In Ava's handwriting, it read, "To the only guy who listens better than you, love, A." Jack swallowed hard. The dog wasn't just Ava's partner. He was Shadow, her canine, trained, loyal, left behind, and somehow still holding on. That explained everything. The way Shadow moved, the way he waited, the way he led Jack through the snow, straight to her beacon. Shadow hadn't left. He had stayed, guarded something, protected her memory. And maybe, just maybe, he was leading Jack somewhere even deeper. Jack sat down beside the dog, one arm loosely draped over its back. The room smelled of wet wool, pine, and melted snow. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, it was still. He looked at the photo again. Then at the beacon. Someone had tried to smash the unit deliberately, the battery cracked, wires gutted. Someone didn't want it found. But Shadow had refused to let it go. And Jack, he wasn't about to let go either. In the morning, he would go back. He didn't care if the forest was restricted. He didn't care about procedure or clearance. This wasn't about a case anymore, it was about Ava, and the dog that never gave up on her. "Tomorrow," Jack whispered into the quiet, "we go together." Shadow opened one eye, just for a moment, and thumped his tail against the floor. Morning in Pinebridge was a quiet thing. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick white hush that blanketed the world in stillness. Frost clung to the pine trees like silver armor, and smoke curled gently from chimneys. For most people, it was just another cold October day. But for Jack Callahan, it was the start of something else entirely. He stood at the window of his cabin, holding a cup of gas station coffee that had long gone cold. On the table behind him lay two things: a locator beacon marked with the initials A. Carter, damaged but undeniable, a photo of Ava standing tall beside a younger, prouder Shadow, and next to the heater, wrapped in an old blanket, the real Shadow slept, wounded, silent, and still holding secrets. Jack stared into the trees, mind racing. He hadn't spoken Ava's name out loud in half a year. He had trained himself not to, because saying it made it too real, made her death too final. But now the dog she had trusted with her life was sleeping in his home. Now her gear had surfaced in the woods. Now everything he thought was buried had clawed its way back to the surface, and with it came the memories. 6 months ago, Denver. The meeting room had smelled like copier toner and stale coffee. Jack remembered sitting across from Charles Whitmore, the deputy director of internal ops. A man with slick silver hair, a tailored suit, and a voice so smooth it made lies sound like lullabies. Ava had been the one to speak up. "There's a leak," she'd said calmly. "And I believe it's internal." Whitmore had smiled, tilted his head slightly. "That's a bold claim, Agent Carter." "Not a claim," Ava replied. "A pattern. Controlled busts are going sideways. Locations are compromised before we arrive. Someone's feeding intel." Jack remembered the moment clearly. How her voice had been steady, how he hadn't backed her up. He was tired. Overworked, burnt out, and honestly, he didn't want to believe someone that high up could be dirty. Whitmore gave a little chuckle that day, sipped his water. "You should be careful where you aim accusations like that," he said. Then he dismissed the room. 3 days later, Ava requested a solo infiltration assignment at Pier 17. Jack protested half-heartedly. She insisted. "You trust me, right?" she asked. "Always," he said. But trust hadn't saved her. Jack pulled out a worn binder from the shelf, a copy of the Pier 17 case file, unofficial, filled with scribbled notes and floor plans. He flipped through the pages, landing on a terrain map Ava had hand-marked before her final mission. Near the edge of the page, faint and almost missed, was a red line, drawn in pen, leading away from the pier perimeter into a section marked Northridge. At the end of the line, in her tight, angled handwriting, "Old bunker. Hidden." Jack stared at it for a long moment. Northridge. An abandoned training zone from the Cold War era, mostly forgotten, mostly sealed. He hadn't heard the name in years, but now it was calling again. And it wasn't a coincidence. He folded the map and slid it into his jacket. Shadow stirred behind him. Jack turned to look. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady. One eye blinked open, tracking Jack's movement. He knelt beside him, pressing a gentle hand to the shepherd's side. "You stayed," he murmured. "You waited for her." Shadow didn't move. Just watched him quietly, his amber eyes shining with something beyond words. Grief, loyalty, and maybe hope. Jack sat there a while longer, back pressed against the wall, the cabin quiet except for the faint ticking of the heater and the occasional gust of wind outside. His thoughts turned inward again. To Ava, to the docks, to the last time he heard her voice in his earpiece. "Planting the bug now," she'd said. A pause, then static. Then nothing, no screams, no gunfire. Just sudden, jarring silence. He had replayed that moment in his head 1,000 times. He never got to see the body. Never got a funeral, just a cold report, presumed KIA, mission compromised. But now he had a map, a beacon, and a dog that had carried Ava's story in silence for 6 months. It was time to listen. Jack stood and grabbed his badge, his sidearm, and the folded terrain map. He took one last glance at the sleeping dog. "We go at first light," he said softly. "You and me." Shadow didn't move, but his tail gave a slow, tired thump. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. Too much noise in his head. Too much guilt he'd buried deep. He thought about what Ava had said before she left. "Don't trust the comms. Don't trust Whitmore." She had been right. And he hadn't listened. But now, he would. Because somewhere out there, in the snow-covered woods of Pinebridge, Ava's story hadn't ended yet. And the one soul who had never stopped believing that had 4 legs, a scar on his side, and eyes full of memory. In the stillness before dawn, Jack placed a hand on Shadow's shoulder. "Tomorrow," he whispered again, "we bring her home." And this time he meant it. By the time the sun climbed over the ridgeline, Jack Callahan and Shadow were already miles into the woods. The dog moved slow but determined, limping on his injured leg, a makeshift bandage wrapped tight with gauze and flannel. Jack had reinforced it with strips of nylon from an old backpack. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. They didn't talk, they just walked. One man, one dog, and a trail few would have dared follow. Northridge. It was once a Cold War training ground forgotten by most, erased from maps, and buried beneath decades of snow and silence. Only a handful of the old shelters still existed. The rest, left to rot beneath the trees, that's where Ava's red line had led. Jack had memorized the map, followed the ridge, crossed the dried-up creek bed, and pushed past the brush until he reached the small slope marked with a hand-drawn X. Shadow stopped. His ears twitched. His nose lifted into the wind. Then, without hesitation, he began digging near a crooked pine. Jack dropped beside him and helped bare hands, scraping frozen soil, heart pounding. And then, metal. A dull clang echoed through the clearing. They uncovered a steel hatch, square and rusted, almost flush with the ground. A broken lock dangled from its side. The air around it smelled of damp iron and something sharper, something like copper and rot. Jack clicked on his flashlight. His breath was visible in the frigid air as he gripped the handle and pulled. It resisted, groaned, then creaked open with a shuddering cry. What lay beneath wasn't a shelter. It was a bunker. Jack descended the short ladder, Shadow whimpering softly at the edge above. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark. The air was colder here, like the cold had roots. Cinder block walls, exposed wires, a rusted cot in the corner. A broken chair, a shattered light fixture swinging slightly from the ceiling. And on the floor, near the far wall, Jack stopped breathing. It was a patch of black fabric. He stepped forward and picked it up slowly. Ava's unit badge, torn at the corner, dirt-stained but unmistakable. Near it lay a used medical syringe. The cap was gone, and smeared across the lower cinder block wall, a streak of blood. Dark, dried, human. Jack's fingers curled into fists. She'd been here, not just in passing. She'd been held here. Shadow let out a low, anxious whine from above. Jack stepped deeper into the bunker, every muscle tensed. There were no chains, no cameras, no restraints, but the room screamed of violence, the kind that came sudden, with no time to scream. He scanned the floor for drag marks, scuffed shoes, anything. But there was nothing recent, just absence, the kind that made the air feel too heavy. He turned off the flashlight for a moment, let the darkness settle, closed his eyes, and whispered her name. Ava. He climbed back up into the clearing, sealing the hatch behind him. Shadow leaned against his leg, tail twitching faintly. Jack rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. She was here, he said, voice hoarse. You knew. You brought me. Shadow didn't bark, didn't move, but his eyes met Jack's, and that was enough. Back at the cabin, Jack laid out the badge and syringe beside the beacon. The pieces were forming something darker than he expected. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This wasn't just internal corruption. This was a black site. Someone had gone to great lengths to make Ava disappear and erase the place she was held. But they missed something. They missed Shadow. That night, Jack didn't rest. He flipped through Ava's old notes, reread her warnings about Whitmore. He remembered her whisper after that closed meeting. Don't trust the comms. Don't trust him. He runs deeper than we think. Jack had dismissed it. Thought she was being paranoid. Now it felt like prophecy. The next morning, he stood outside the sheriff's office. Snow crunched beneath his boots. His breath fogged the air. He carried a manila folder in one hand and a photo in the other. Inside was everything. The smashed locator, the red-marked map, Ava's badge, a picture of her standing beside Shadow. He walked in and laid the file on Chief Helen Blake's desk. She didn't look up. You know Northridge is off limits, she said, flipping through reports. You need a warrant, Jack. A missing person report, something. It's not a request, Jack said quietly. I'm going. Helen finally looked at him. You get hurt out there. I can't protect you. He nodded. Understood. She didn't sign anything, but she didn't stop him either. That afternoon, Jack and Shadow returned to Northridge. The forest was silent, snow deeper than before. They reached the bunker again. But this time, something was different. Jack stopped suddenly. Shadow tensed. His ears went stiff. His nose twitched in the air. Then he growled. Low, deep, primal. That's when Jack saw it. A camera, hidden in a tree stump, aimed directly at the bunker entrance, and a second later, a shot rang out. Wreck. Shadow lunged. Jack dove behind a tree. The dog let out a yelp, a sharp, guttural sound. Then silence. Jack scrambled toward him. Blood. Shadow was bleeding. He'd taken the bullet meant for Jack. Jack's training kicked in. He fired blindly toward the ridge, pulled Shadow behind a fallen log, pressed his scarf to the wound, checked his pulse, held him close. "You stay with me," he whispered. "You stay." Shadow's breathing was ragged but still there. He'd saved Jack's life. Again. But now Jack knew one more thing for certain. Someone was watching them. Someone was still trying to bury the truth. And whatever had happened to Ava, it wasn't over. Not yet. Snow pressed into Jack Callahan's boots as he moved slow, deliberate, and out of breath. In his arms, Shadow was bleeding. The scarf Jack had wrapped around the dog's shoulder was already soaked through, blood seeping into the flannel like ink in paper. The bullet had struck high, just beneath the scapula, but Shadow hadn't whimpered again since the first cry. He was quiet. Too quiet. Jack pushed through the trees, each step heavier than the last. His shoulder burned from the strain. His eyes scanned the ridgeline, but the shooter was gone. No footprints, no movement. Just cold air and the knowledge that they weren't supposed to survive. Someone had been watching. Someone had pulled the trigger. And they hadn't missed by mistake. He found a shallow cave beneath an overhang of rock. It wasn't much, but it blocked the wind, hid them from the sky, and offered just enough shelter to stop the bleeding. Jack laid Shadow down on a folded coat, hands trembling as he cleaned the wound with snow and water from his canteen. "You're still with me," Jack whispered, running a hand gently over the dog's fur. "You held on before. You can do it again." Shadow blinked, barely. Then he closed his eyes. The cold pressed in around them. The forest above was still, but in Jack's mind, a war had begun. This wasn't just about Ava anymore. It was about everything: the fake reports, the sealed mission files, the convenient technical glitches in Ava's comms the night she went missing. The bullet meant for him. Someone was tying up loose ends. And now, Jack wasn't a man searching for answers. He was a man who knew too much. He thought back to 6 months ago. Denver. That last internal meeting before the Pier 17 operation. Charles Whitmore had been there, his voice smooth as always, hands folded neatly on the table like he was hosting a brunch instead of handling federal narcotics intel. And Ava had been bolder than usual that day. She'd sat stiffly, eyes sharp, and dropped a line that made the entire room tense. "We may have a breach," she said. "High level, possibly this room." Silence. Then Whitmore smiled. "Too calm, too slow. Those are serious words, Agent Carter." "Then take them seriously," she replied. Jack had said nothing. Back then, he still believed in the system, still believed the badges meant something. But now the silence from that room echoed in his bones, because silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's protection, a barrier built by the guilty. Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out the terrain map Ava had marked. Her red line pointed to the bunker they'd just left. He traced it with his thumb, then flipped the page. A second mark. Barely visible, just north of their current location, a different kind of structure. Tighter lines, narrower margin, containment. Not storage, and next to it, in Ava's handwriting, too small for supply drop, could be holding cell. Emergency fallback. Jack's heart beat faster. He looked down at Shadow. The dog's breathing was shallow but rhythmic. He was holding on. Somehow, through blood and snow and pain, he was still fighting. And if Shadow hadn't given up, neither would Jack. He stepped to the mouth of the cave. ears straining. That's when he heard it. A voice. Barely audible, broken, almost lost in the wind. "Help!" Jack froze. His heart surged. He turned, checked Shadow one last time, then grabbed his flashlight and followed the sound through the trees, down a slope slick with ice. Another call, closer now, fainter still. He dropped to his knees and brushed aside a thick layer of snow and pine needles. Steel. Not a hatch this time. A grate. Thin. Concealed. Hidden intentionally. He wedged a branch underneath, used his weight, and pried it open with a screech. A ladder led into the dark. He didn't hesitate. The room was small, concrete walls. One flickering bulb swinging overhead. A cot. A bucket. Shackles bolted into the floor, and in the corner, Ava Carter. Thin, pale, eyes sunken but burning. Jack dropped beside her, heart thundering. "You're alive," he said. She gave the faintest smile. "Barely," she rasped. He snapped the last shackle with a hard pull, then helped her to her feet. She could barely stand, but she leaned into him, one arm tight around his shoulder. Her voice was hoarse but clear. "It's Whitmore," she whispered. "He's not just leaking intel." "He's running it." Jack's stomach turned. "What?" "Everything," Ava said. "The raids. The busts. Their covers. He filters real shipments through black market chains and buries the rest. Weapons, narcotics, even personnel disappearances." Jack held her tighter. "And you?" "I got too close," she said. "I kept a log. They took everything, but they didn't find the copy I hid." She pointed to a crack beneath the cot. Jack reached in, pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. Worn, water-stained. But intact, inside maps, names, codes, drop points, years of secrets, years of betrayal. Back at the cave, Jack gently laid her beside Shadow. Her fingers trembled as she touched the dog's ears. "You stayed," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "You never left me." Shadow gave the faintest wag of his tail. They didn't speak much that night. There was nothing left to say, just the truth sitting between them. Cold, bloody, and finally exposed. The air inside the cave was bitter with frost and silence. Jack Callahan sat beside the two beings he had nearly lost, Ava Carter, barely alive, and Shadow, the battered German shepherd who had never stopped believing she was out there. The only light came from his flashlight, casting long shadows on the rock walls like ghosts whispering secrets. Ava rested against the curve of his shoulder, shivering despite the layers of coats he'd wrapped around her. Her voice had faded, but her grip on the notebook, the one she'd hidden from her captors, remained iron-tight. Shadow lay nearby, his breathing shallow, his eyes barely open. Jack looked at both of them and whispered, "You're safe now." But he knew better. They were alive, yes, but safe. Not even close. They couldn't stay there long. Whoever shot at them would come back. And this time they'd come prepared. Jack adjusted the strap on his sidearm, then carefully lifted Ava into his arms. She was lighter than he remembered, fragile, like a breath wrapped in skin. "Don't drop me," she murmured. "I carried you through worse," Jack replied, his voice tight with emotion. She let out a ghost of a laugh. "You always said that." He turned to Shadow. The dog stirred, slowly, painfully. When Jack tried to lift him too, Shadow pushed back with a low grunt. He wanted to walk. Jack gave him a look. "You sure?" Shadow gave a soft whine, then pressed his nose to Ava's hand. "Then let's go," Jack said. They moved through the snow like shadows themselves, one step at a time, every movement careful, quiet. Ava leaned into Jack, her breath warm against his collar. She held the notebook close to her chest like it was her last heartbeat. Shadow limped ahead, his paw prints leaving a dotted trail of blood behind them, but he never stopped, never looked back. He was leading them out, just like he'd led Jack in. It took hours to reach the tree line near Timberline Pass. The forest opened into a clearing, the mountains glowing pale blue under a rising moon, and then a sound. Not the wind, not trees shifting, rotor blades. Jack looked up. A searchlight sliced through the sky like a blade. Rescue. He stumbled into the clearing, waving one arm while holding Ava with the other. His voice cracked from shouting. The light fixed on them. Then it widened to include Shadow, still standing, tail low but steady. The helicopter touched down. 2 officers in tactical gear rushed forward. A woman with dark braids and sharp eyes approached first. "You Jack Callahan?" He nodded. She saw Ava, her cracked lips, her half-shut eyes. Then her gaze dropped to the dog. "This dog took a bullet?" Jack's throat tightened. "He saved us both." She didn't hesitate. "Then he rides with us." Inside the chopper, warmth returned in waves. Jack held Ava's hand under the blanket as medics worked around them. Shadow lay at their feet, an IV in his leg, wrapped in fresh gauze. The woman leaned in again. "Name's Officer Grace Howard. You all just made one hell of a noise." Jack looked at her, eyes tired but burning. "We're not done yet." They landed at Pine Bridge Regional Medical Center just before dawn. FBI agents, state police, reporters. Sirens. And Jack never let go of Ava's hand. He stayed by her side as she gave her statement every name, every transfer, every location. The notebook backed it all up. Charles Whitmore was arrested in his office before noon. So were 3 agents and a logistics manager. The story broke before sunset. Conspiracy, corruption, treason. But for Jack, it was simpler than that. He had her back, and Shadow had never left her. 3 days later, Jack stood outside the town's animal clinic. Inside, behind the glass, Shadow lay on a thick blanket, his shoulder shaved, stitches clean. The vet had said he'd walk again, maybe even run. Jack just nodded, eyes fixed on the dog who had never once asked for thanks. Behind him, Ava sat in the truck, bundled in a thick coat, her face turned toward the window. "He stayed," she said softly. Jack turned. "Yeah," he whispered. "He always does." Night came down like a curtain soaked in ink. The forest so blindingly white just hours ago had turned into a labyrinth of black branches and shadows. Every tree looked like a threat. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. But Jack Callahan didn't stop walking. Ava Carter, still weak, leaned against his shoulder with every step. Her breath was shallow but steady. One arm clung to his jacket, the other held tight to the notebook that could take down a government. Beside them, Shadow limped through the snow, his paw prints red with reopened stitches. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. This was survival now. One step. Then another. And never look back. They were less than a mile from the old ranger station near Timberline Pass. That was the rendezvous point. From there, they'd have signal. Maybe shelter. Maybe someone would come. But Jack had been in combat zones before. He knew when he was still being hunted. And this wasn't over. The deeper they went, the quieter Ava became. Her head rested against his chest now, and her hand once gripping the notebook like it was oxygen had loosened. He paused beneath a pine tree and shifted her weight gently. "You still with me?" he whispered. Her lips moved, just barely. "Still. Here." Jack looked ahead. Snowflakes danced sideways in the wind, erasing their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. And Shadow? The dog had stopped. His ears pricked forward, nose twitching. Jack followed his gaze. Just ahead, in the clearing movement, a flicker of light, then gone. Jack's pulse surged. They weren't alone. He ducked low, pulling Ava into the crook of a fallen log, motioning for Shadow to stay close. The shepherd obeyed instantly, pressing into the snow without a sound. Jack's fingers brushed the grip of his sidearm. He didn't want to fire. Not here, not with Ava barely holding on, but he would. He'd do anything to protect them. The light flickered again farther off now, fading. Then silence. Had they been spotted? Or was someone circling back? Jack's instinct screamed one thing: move, now. They broke through the last stretch of woods just before 3 a.m. The ranger station stood in the distance, half covered in snow, a skeleton of what it once was. But it had walls, a roof, a radio tower. They made it to the porch. Jack kicked the door open with one boot and carried Ava inside, laying her gently on a dusty bench. He wrapped her in a wool blanket he found in a supply trunk, then turned to Shadow. The dog collapsed onto the wooden floor, panting but alive. "You did good, buddy," Jack whispered. Shadow thumped his tail once in reply. Ava stirred. Her eyes opened slowly. She looked at the rafters, at the broken window pane, then at Jack. "We're here?" she asked. "We're here," he said. She reached for his hand. He gave it to her. Outside, the wind had finally slowed. The storm passed, and for the first time in days, Jack exhaled. But the peace didn't last long. From the corner of the room, Shadow lifted his head sharply, growled, then barked once. Loud, sharp, Jack was on his feet in an instant. Through the broken window, he saw it, a flash of movement in the tree line, too fast for an animal, too slow for wind. Someone was watching them. Jack raised his weapon, eyes locked on the trees. But then another light, a beam, white, powerful, sweeping over the clearing, a helicopter. Real this time, not a threat. Rescue. Shadow barked, againless urgency, more confirmation. Jack dropped his weapon and turned back to Ava. "They found us," he said. She nodded faintly, eyes closing once more. By dawn, the three of them were on their way back to Pine Bridge. Ava lay bundled in thermal blankets, her head resting against Jack's shoulder. Shadow was secured beside them, his wound freshly dressed, an IV in his leg. But his eyes stayed open. Watching, guarding, still fighting. Jack looked down at both of them and said nothing. He didn't need to. They had made it. Through betrayal, through blood, through a forest that tried to swallow them whole. Together they'd walked out of the dark. The waiting room at Pine Bridge Regional Hospital wasn't built for moments like this. It was too small. Too quiet, too clean, but behind a closed door at the far end of the hallway, everything was changing. Inside, Ava Carter sat wrapped in a wool blanket, flanked by 2 federal agents and a court recorder. Her voice, hoarse but steady, filled the room with a truth too heavy for silence. She gave them names, dates, coordinates, routines. Every bribe, every drop site, every raid that had been rigged. And then she handed over the leather-bound notebook, the one she'd hidden beneath the floor of her prison, the one she'd guarded like it was her own pulse. On those pages, years of corruption, proof of betrayal, evidence of conspiracy. The kind of truth that doesn't ask to be believed, it demands it. Outside the room, Jack Callahan paced the hallway, arms crossed, jaw tight. He wasn't a federal agent anymore. Not officially. But today none of that mattered. He had brought Ava home. He had carried her out of a grave someone tried to dig in secret. And most importantly, he wasn't alone. Beside him, Shadow sat quietly. A clean white bandage wrapped around his shoulder, IV line clipped and gone. His coat had begun to recover its sheen. His eyes, always watching, held a calm that Jack hadn't seen since before the storm. People passed and stared. Some smiled, some whispered. But none of them understood. This dog, this soldier had saved them both. By noon, the arrest warrant was signed. Charles Whitmore was taken from his office in handcuffs, stunned and silent, as news crews swarmed the courthouse steps. 3 additional agents were detained, 1 logistics manager, a contractor from the Bureau's tech team. It all unraveled like thread. Years of false intel. Fabricated reports, real weapons and narcotics rerouted through clean ops then sold on the black market. And at the center of it all, the man who once sat at the top of Jack and Ava's command chain. Whitmore never saw it coming, because he had underestimated the one thing he couldn't erase. Shadow. The headlines broke faster than the snowfall outside. Federal corruption network exposed in avalanche of evidence. Missing agent found alive, leads charges against former command. K9 hero identified as key to breaking the case. Some called it justice. Some called it redemption, but for Jack, it was something simpler. Closure. 3 days later, he stood at the window of the Pine Bridge Animal Clinic. Shadow lay on a thick bed of fleece inside, resting peacefully, a soft toy between his paws, a gift from a nurse who'd cried reading the news. Behind Jack, Ava sat in the truck, bundled in a puffer coat, sipping weak hospital coffee. "They say he'll run again," she said quietly. Jack turned, smiled. "He'll run circles around both of us." That evening, Chief Helen Blake arrived at Jack's cabin. Her grey coat dusted in snow, scarf pulled tight. She handed him a manila envelope, no words at first. He opened it. Commendation, Medal of Valor, Special Field Recognition. Full reinstatement. Jack looked up. "I don't want it." Helen raised one eyebrow. "No?" He exhaled slowly. "I just want a quiet job. Here, Pine Bridge PD. And a dog to come home to." She studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow, rare nod. "That we can do." Justice had been served, but the story wasn't over. Because some truths don't end in a courtroom. They begin again in quiet places, in late nights, old trails, and in the heartbeat of a dog who waited 6 months in the snow, refusing to give up. Spring came late to Pine Bridge that year. The snow melted slowly, retreating from rooftops and trails like it too had been holding its breath. Cold creeks ran again. Wildflowers peeked through soft earth. And with the thaw came something new, something the town hadn't seen before. On the edge of town, where an old ranger station once stood abandoned, a sign now hung carved from oak and stained by hand. Shadow Sanctuary for healing. For heroes. For hope. 2 wings, built from local timber and polished stone, branched like open arms. One side was for canine rehabilitation. The other a therapy center for children, veterans, and anyone carrying invisible wounds. And at the heart of it all was the dog who had made it possible. Shadow. On opening day, the sanctuary hummed with gentle life. Children laughed near a mural of dogs running through forests. Volunteers unpacked boxes of donated toys, blankets, and treats. Veterans sat quietly on benches beneath pine trees, their shoulders heavy, but their eyes softening as they watched the animals roam. Near a handmade wooden sign, carved with Shadow's name, the real thing lay curled on a thick blanket. His right shoulder, though healed, still bore the scar. But his eyes were clear, his breathing easy. He watched everything, not like a guard anymore, like a shepherd finally home. A little girl with pale skin and a blue sweater 2 sizes too big knelt beside him. Her name was Sophie Carter, 9 years old, and until recently she hadn't spoken a word in over 3 years. Not since the night she was removed from an abusive home and placed into the care of her aunt in Pine Bridge. No one forced her to talk, no one pushed her to play. They just let her sit beside Shadow. Day after day, drawing, petting his fur, sometimes crying into his side. And today, as visitors filled the courtyard, Sophie leaned forward, placed one small hand on Shadow's back, and whispered, so faintly the wind nearly took it, "I'm not scared anymore." Inside the main hall, Ava Carter stood near the welcome desk, arms crossed, watching through the wide windows. Her hair was shorter now, a practical choice, but also a kind of shedding. Of captivity, of silence, of fear. She wore a blue fleece vest embroidered with the words, Second Shadow, Program Director. Beside her stood Jack Callahan, now in Pinebridge PD uniform again, the same badge he once carried with shame, now pinned to his chest with quiet pride. They didn't speak. They just watched as the townspeople brought casseroles, folding chairs and leashes, as donations of food and collars stacked at the gates, as laughter reel, full laughter filled the space between the trees. And above it all stood Shadow, not barking, not chasing, just present, as if reminding them, "You're safe now." Later, as the sun dipped low and families began to drift home, Ava and Jack sat beneath the tree near Shadow's blanket. Children ran across the field. A golden retriever puppy chased a leaf. Jack exhaled. "Did you ever think it would end like this?" Ava sipped her cocoa. "No, but I'm glad it did." They sat in silence for a while. Not the kind that hurts, the kind that heals, the kind that says, "We made it." And not just survived, but built something better from the pieces. Inside the sanctuary's visitor guide, just under the mission statement, was a quote. It wasn't from a general or a philosopher. Just a quiet note that Ava had scribbled the day they broke ground. Healing doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it walks beside you nose first, tail low, and refuses to leave until you're ready to begin again. The afternoon sun bathed Shadow Sanctuary in a warm, golden light. It filtered through the tall pines, danced across the garden beds, and settled gently on the backs of the dogs lounging beneath shade trees. The world had softened like even time was willing to slow down here. Near the courtyard's edge, Shadow lay beside the wooden sign carved in his name. His breathing was calm, rhythmic. His eyes half closed, watching the world, not with alertness, but with peace. At 8 years old, his coat had grayed around the muzzle. His steps had slowed. But his presence, still steady, still sacred. Children no longer squealed around him. They sat close, quiet, as if they understood. This wasn't just a dog. He was a keeper of stories, a guardian of scars, a heartbeat that waited through snow and silence until someone said, "You're not alone anymore." That morning, Sophie Carter arrived early. Blue sweater, braided hair, sketchpad under one arm. She walked alone to the spot near Shadow's blanket, settled beside him, and opened her notebook. She didn't say anything. She never did. Instead, she drew a tree, a dog, a girl. Shadow watched, listened. And then, as the wind moved through the grass, Sophie looked up, brushed a strand of hair from her face and whispered, "Good boy." 2 words, soft, simple. But they might as well have cracked open the sky. Nearby, Ava Carter froze mid-step. She turned. Jack, standing beside the garden fence, dropped his coffee. A few feet away, a volunteer gasped. Another began to cry. Sophie didn't notice. She kept petting Shadow, her voice just loud enough now to carry, "I was scared before, but not here. Not with you. You waited, didn't you?" Shadow shifted slightly, nose pressing into her palm. That was his answer. Later that day, Jack and Ava sat with Sophie and her aunt under the porch awning. The girl's voice remained soft, sometimes just a whisper, but it was there. She spoke of dreams, of wanting to help dogs like Shadow, of never wanting to leave this place. "You won't have to," Ava said, her eyes glistening. "This is your home now, too." Jack reached down and gave Shadow a long, gentle stroke between the ears. "You did it again," he murmured, You brought someone back. Shadow let out a low sigh and rested his head on Jack's boot. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and cast the sanctuary in dusky amber, Ava stepped up to the small podium in front of the staff and families gathered for the one-year anniversary celebration. Her voice was clear, warm, earnest. "I never thought I'd stand in front of people again," she began. "And I never thought the one who'd bring me back would have 4 legs and more patience than I ever deserved." Soft laughter rippled through the courtyard. She paused, eyes settling on Sophie, who sat quietly beside Shadow, fingers brushing his fur with quiet reverence. "This place was built not just for healing," Ava continued. "It was built for those who waited, the ones who stayed when others gave up, like Shadow, like so many of you. Like Sophie." Sophie blinked, then gave the smallest smile. Jack stepped forward next, holding a ribbon-cutting shears for the new wing, the second Shadow Programmer space designed for dogs and children to grow, learn, and heal together. He looked out over the crowd, then down at Shadow. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think dogs were just tools, trained to obey, to perform." He knelt beside Shadow, placed a hand on the dog's shoulder. "But this one, he didn't follow orders, he followed his heart. And he never stopped. Not in the storm, not through the gunfire, not even when everyone else had walked away." He looked up at Sophie. "If he's taught us anything, it's that sometimes the greatest kind of healing doesn't come with words or noise or glory." He paused. "It comes with quiet steps in the snow, a warm breath in the cold, and the courage to stay." He cut the ribbon. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, it was gentle, like rain on a cabin roof, like the exhale of someone finally safe. As the crowd began to disperse and dusk wrapped its arms around the sanctuary, Jack and Ava sat beneath the tree where Shadow now rested. Sophie curled up beside him, her sketchpad resting on his belly, the drawing. A girl and a dog, walking through the snow, side by side. Ava glanced at Jack. "Did you ever think it would lead here?" He smiled faintly. "No, but I'm glad it did." Shadow stirred once more, lifted his head, looked at the family he'd helped build, then dropped his muzzle with a soft huff and closed his eyes. "We don't choose where our stories begin, but sometimes we get to choose who walks beside us as they continue. In life, we all face moments that leave us feeling lost, grief too heavy, silence too deep, or wounds that seem beyond healing. But the story of Jack, Ava, and Shadow reminds us of something timeless. Loyalty, quiet courage, and unwavering love can guide us through even the darkest places. Shadow didn't speak. He didn't argue or beg. He simply stayed, through storms, through blood, through time. He waited, not because he had to, but because he chose to. And that kind of love, that kind of faith, is what holds the world together when everything else falls apart. Sometimes healing doesn't come in grand gestures or loud victories. Sometimes it comes in quiet steps, in a child's first whisper, in the soft sigh of a dog who never gave up. It comes when someone chooses to stay. And maybe that's the lesson. We don't always get to choose where our story begins or what we lose along the way, but we can always choose to walk beside someone, to show up, to hold on, even in silence. Especially in silence, that's where the real healing begins.